This is DontCallTechSupport, and this is the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black Edition. This will be a simple review of the cooler, and I'll compare it to the Arctic Freezer i32 that I'm using right now on a i5-6600K overclocked to 4.8 GHz at 1.4 volts. I'll be testing the cooler with the supplied fan, both at max speed to see the max cooling capabilities of the cooler and at 1000 RPM to see how it performs while being whisper quiet. But before we get into the numbers, let's take a look at what's inside the box. This is all the mounting hardware that you get with the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black Edition. Everything you see here comes in this white accessory box, along with a couple of extra things if you want to mount a push-pull fan or another fan. And there's also the plastic backplates, that's for both the Intel and AMD system. There's these AMD brackets that fits both the AM3 and the AM4 platform. There's some plastic retention stuff for the screws that you mount in the backplate. Not quite sure what to call it. There's also a socket for tightening down the motherboard standoff. And here on the right you have the Intel brackets, this fits both the 11.5 and 20 whatever. So if you want to mount this on, for instance, socket 2011, you just pull on this screw and then you just move it up because it's mounted in this slotted hole, and then you just move it down if you want to mount it on LGA 11.5. These are the motherboard standoffs for the Intel system, which are mounted onto the motherboard, hence the motherboard standoff. And these are the ones for the AMD system. So with the cooler you also get a little tube of thermal paste. This is the Cooler Master Master Gel Pro. This is supposed to be quality stuff. And well, I don't doubt them. I don't think I can get this in focus, but yeah, okay. So you don't use the entire thing on one CPU. This should be enough for a couple of CPUs if you want to switch the cooler or reseat it or change the CPU, whatever. These screws are used to mount the brackets onto the cooler itself through these holes, which are countersunk so that the screws doesn't protrude from the surface, which is quite handy. Well, it looks good at least. Now let's mount the cooler onto the i5-6600K CPU. I currently have a Pentium for some testing for future videos, so we'll have to change out that first. Mounting the cooler is less fiddly outside of the case, but I will mount it with the motherboard in place because I can't be bothered to take it out. But to simplify things, I have removed the RAM and the video card so I get a bit more space. And well, okay, so when you're applying thermal paste, you just need a pea-sized dot on the middle of the CPU, and when you're tightening the cooler, the thermal paste will be distributed over the CPU surface. And when you do tighten the cooler, start by just threading the screw in place, then tighten them down in a crossed pattern. After that, mount the fan, which can be a bit fiddly, but if you mount it one side at a time, it'll be possible without too much of a hassle. Alright, that's everything in place. Let's see how it performs. We start off with an encoding workload in Handbrake with the fan at 1000 RPMs. The Cooler Master kept the CPU at 75 degrees Celsius with a peak to 81 degrees Celsius. Turning the fan to its maximum speed of 2000 RPM, the temperature fell about 10 degrees Celsius from an average of temp of 75 degrees to 66 degrees Celsius with a peak at 71 degrees. The Arctic Freezer did a bit better with the fan at 1000 RPMs with an average temperature 2 degrees cooler than the 212 Black Edition at 73.5 Celsius with a peak at 79 Celsius. Now with the fan at the full speed, which is 1400 RPM on the Arctic Freezer, which is 600 RPM slower than the Cooler Master, the i5 was 3 degrees Celsius warmer than the 212 Black Edition with a peak temperature of 74 degrees. So what about a gaming load? Well, let's head into Division 2 and find out. So in Division 2, the Cooler Master kept the i5 at an average temperature of 66 degrees Celsius with a peak at 71 degrees Celsius with a fan at 1000 RPM. At max speed, we'd lower the average temperature by 4 degrees to 62 degrees average with a peak at 65 degrees Celsius. The Arctic cooler was slightly warmer at 1000 RPM this time, at 67.6 degrees Celsius with a peak of 72 degrees. Maxing the fan on the Arctic cooler or Arctic freezer lowered the temperature to 65 degrees Celsius with a peak at 70 degrees. So then the Cooler Master 212 Black Edition is similar in performance to the Arctic Freezer i32. Now there is a newer Arctic Freezer version, I think it's i34, something like that, which is probably a bit better. But I'm switching out the Arctic Cooler because of the aesthetics, not because of the performance. But what about noise? Well, let's find out. At 1000 RPMs, the Silencio fan on the Cooler Master is 1 decibel quieter than the Arctic Freezer, and at full speed the Cooler Master is 1 decibel louder than the Arctic Freezer, which is to be expected with a 600 RPM higher fan speed. Well, that's all I have for this time. I hope you have a lovely day. Now I'm off to, well, I'm gonna clean the office. That's not fun. Oh well, farewell.